Hey everyone, today we're looking at dual R9 390s and CrossFire versus SLI GTX 970s to try and determine one, which is better, and two, is it even worth doing multi-card configurations in opposition to obviously a single, more expensive card like a 980 Ti. For more depth on that specific aspect of the argument, check out our previous video, 980 Ti versus SLI GTX 970s, to see what we thought about multi-card configurations in the modern era versus a single GPU. For today's test, we are using one R9 390 card with two GPUs on it, so it's actually a dual-core video card, and that is the PowerColor Devil 13 R9 390 dual GPU card. It is massive, quite obviously. You can tell from the side profile view of it here. It's got 32 power headers, which is actually about what most dual card setups will take if you're using two independent cards. It just looks a lot more impressive on one. And it's also got a huge heatsink that's very loud, but we don't do noise testing, so that is one thing that I will not be objectively looking at today. I can subjectively tell you right now that this card is much louder than any other video card I've ever tested, especially at load. And as far as the test we are running today for objective measurements, we're looking at the power consumption of 970s and SLI versus R9 390s in CrossFire, and we're also looking at the frame rate performance and temperature or thermal performance. As always, you can check the website for test methodology, the testing systems used, and all the charts not shown here. Hit the link in the description below for more information on that, or just go to gamersnexus.net. Today we're starting with the power draw. So the PCS dual card GPU or dual GPU card draws 582.73 watts at full system load. That is the full system power consumption. The R9 390 measured at 341 watts previously with just one R9 390, and the SLI GTX 970s are at 411.72 watts. So the 970s quite obviously are significantly lower power consumption for peak system load. With the CrossFire SLI battle here head to head, that is 170 watts difference between the two configurations, and that is actually noticeable enough to change what kind of power supply you're buying. But let's look at how that impacts thermals and then performance. Thermals are average between both these cards, but the dual card, the PCS Devil 13, is very loud. And we test on an open bench, but if you had it in a case, it would still be pretty loud. The thermals delta T over ambient are 54.43 Celsius for the SLI 970s, that's GPU number 1, and 53.62 Celsius for the 390 GPU diode number 1. So the SLI 970 first GPU is actually a bit warmer, marginally 1 degree, than what we're looking at here for the Devil 13. Now this is obviously massively impacted by the cooler used by the manufacturer, the AIB, but the 390 is running cooler just frankly because it's pushing so much air so fast. That's what produces the noise but keeps the temperatures manageable. As for gaming performance, we're only going to focus on a few charts here, but there's a table at the end of this video discussion in the video that shows a head-to-head comparison, who won which round and by what percentage they won. So that is a new thing we're doing that I hope will help you figure out at a glance what's the best option for you. Getting started with FPS, Metro Last Light at 1080p saw the 970s and SLI winning out over the CrossFire 390s, 116 FPS against 115 FPS. That is a 0.87% delta, and that is just barely outside of our margin of test error. So the difference is unnoticeable entirely, and the 980 Ti, for reference, runs at 122 FPS, a slight bit more than either of these two configurations, and costed about the same as the 970s and SLI. The Devil 13, since I didn't already mention it, is priced at $500 after a rebate. It's a $100 rebate, but $600 normally. So depending on whether or not you count that rebate, you're looking at a fairly even head-to-head in terms of price between these configurations. But if you do count the rebate, $500 puts it at the cost of a single 980 and significantly under the cost of a 980 Ti or two 970s, slightly over the cost of a 390X at $420. Getting back into things here, Metro Last Light at 1440p, the 970s and SLI again better than 390s in Crossfire. That is 89 versus 88 FPS or 1.13% delta, again effectively unnoticeable to any user. And the 980 Ti about the same, 89 FPS. At 4K, the CrossFire 390s pull ahead, which makes for some interesting data, even over the 980 Ti, and that's 58 FPS versus 56 FPS on the 970s, and 58 FPS, again, 390s against 57.3 FPS on the 980 Ti. So they're all right there next to each other. Fallout 4 is a quick one. At 1080p, the 970s in SLI are superior to the 390s in Crossfire by a massive amount, 36.5%. That is actually very noticeable in gameplay. That's 81 FPS versus 56 FPS, and that's obviously in our specific test. Of course, your mileage may vary depending on where you test. There's no Crossfire scaling right now in Fallout 4 as far as we can tell. I haven't tested thoroughly on all of the cards, but definitively on two 390s in this instance, at least with the Devil 13, we saw no Crossfire scaling, and that means that your money's effectively wasted if you do have a second physical GPU or a dual GPU card. Shadow of Mordor at 1080p shows the first 1080 victory thus far for the Crossfire 390s over the SLI 970. That's 130 FPS versus 124 FPS. Again, effectively unnoticeable to the user, but worth showing. That's a 4.7% delta. There is a massive 0.1% FPS dip to the tune of 51 FPS versus the average for the 390s, and that is definitely something worth note. The 980 Ti is at 122 FPS, just for sort of a benchmark of where things fall. At 1440p, the Crossfire 390s retain their lead, 100 FPS versus 96, or 4.1%. That's pretty linear. Terrible 0.1% lows, however, on the Crossfire 390s at 32 versus 45 for the SLI 970s. So that is something that AMD has historically struggled with, is the frame times, or 0.1% lows, and that shows here. At 4K, again, 390s in the lead, this time by 8%, which measures up with our previous test where we saw an advantage as resolution increases. That is 61 versus 56.3 FPS. Not super noticeable, but that is starting to enter the range of a player potentially actually noticing it, at least for anyone who's hyper focused on that 60 FPS metric. Just Cause 3 has no reasonable scaling for Crossfire or SLI and is a complete waste for this game. So if you have multi-card configurations from either vendor in Just Cause 3, you're not going to see gains that are worthwhile in the least. Black Ops 3 is actually one of the most interesting benchmarks we have for you today other than Fallout, and that is because at 1440p, the Crossfire 390s produce a 154 FPS versus the 139 FPS of the SLI 970s. Now, you could drop settings just slightly for the SLI 970s and manage to produce a 144 FPS, but we're getting it with pretty much everything maxed out with the Crossfire 390s. The only reason I say that this 10.24% delta is noteworthy here is because Black Ops is the type of game where people with 144 hertz displays will actually want to push for that extra couple FPS to satisfy their 144 hertz throughput potential. As far as Assassin's Creed Syndicate, this one is also problematic, but we had crashing issues that we could not resolve. The game would crash within about a minute of getting into the game with the Crossfire 390s. It worked fine with SLI 970s, not particularly impressive, but fine, it ran. But with the 390s, we were able to execute exactly one task before it crashed, and that shows the 390s and Crossfire slightly behind the 970. However, I would discard this data, or disregard it anyway, just because it's really not too representative of a real scenario since you can't even play the game in our current test. And finally, here's a chart showing the head-to-head matchup of all the data I just went through and some additional data, GTA 5 and others included. So hopefully that'll give you an idea. There are notes here as well. I've gone through most of those in the last minute or so talking, but you can find it all in the description below where the website is linked. Check that out. So then, is it worth getting Crossfire 390s or GTX 970s and SLI? Generally, the 970s and SLI perform a bit better than the Crossfire 390s, and when they do perform better, it is by a lot, and that's because the game or drivers don't support the Crossfire setup properly, especially the case with Just Cause 3 and Fallout 4, where you see the 36% gap between this and two 970s, and that gap is because of the lack of Crossfire scaling. So when the SLIs are better, they are a lot better. When the Crossfire setups are better, they are kind of better by a couple percent, 3, 4, 5% on average, but the biggest gaps we saw were about 10%. Would I buy either of these setups? I'm going to tell you right now, no. I would personally buy a single card, whether that's a 980 Ti or a Fury X, kind of depends on what you're trying to do specifically, what your use case is, do you have a radiator slot, all that stuff. I won't go into that argument here. but I would buy one of those two cards instead of either multi-GPU setup, and that is largely for reasons I discussed pretty heavily in the 970 SLI versus the 980 Ti video, where we see sort of the same day one launch support is a little questionable at times. It takes a bit longer for SLI or CrossFire to get full adequate support for games out the gate. And then of course you're disabling one card sometimes when there's problems, or there's always some kind of micro stutter in some kind of game, it seems like, with these setups, and micro stutter is just infuriating enough again to disable a card. This card anyway is not a bad buy, but there's potentially better value. Now that said, it's currently $500 after a rebate, and that's a pretty big price gap considering your performance is about matched with the 970s. So if you are strictly looking at two 970s versus two 390s, meaning you're not considering the possibility of a 980 Ti for some reason, maybe price, then in that case, this is actually currently with a $100 rebate a better value, but it does depend a bit on what games you're playing, because if you're playing Fallout 4 exclusively, then what I just said is irrelevant, frankly, because crossfire scaling, at least with this setup, is basically non-existent on Fallout 4, and Assassin's Creed Syndicate hardly even worked. So it does depend a bit on which game you're playing, whether this is better than SLI 970s or not to a noticeable level. And because of the degree, the way that it depends on game-to-game performance, support, stuff like that, that is why I generally recommend the single card, because you are basically guaranteed that the game will work, and if it doesn't work, then you can bet that it's probably not working on basically any single card configuration, at least from that manufacturer, and that's a bit more reliable than multi-GPU setups. So that has remained true for a long time. However, the one argument we haven't discussed here is power and thermals. The thermals, don't worry about them, because the temperature was about the same for the SLI 970s and this card, but the Devil 13 was very loud, so it depends on which 390 setup you get. If you just buy two independent 390s, either from Power Color or Sapphire or anyone else, it will be quieter than this thing here. The next thing, with regard to power, the power draw for the two 390 setup was 580 something watts for the peak system load, and for the SLI 970s it was 411 or something like that. So 180, 170 watt difference is big enough that it changes what power supply you're getting, actually by a good amount. There's a good margin there. You need to increase your power supply, so you need to spend more money on it. So that is an argument also worth looking at, depending on what you're trying to build for your system, if you already have a power supply, stuff like that. So that is the look at Crossfire 390s versus GTX 970s and SLI. Article down below for more information. Please hit that Patreon link to the post video if you want to help us out with the next content that we create. And as always, thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.